Jay's Analysis, coming to you live from the lake. I figured that would be appropriate for a discussion of Darwinism and truth, different theories of truth, philosophical theories of truth. My critique is going to be primarily from the perspective of philosophy. Since I have training in that field, that's where I am most able to criticize the position. Although I don't think one has to be trained in biology and every other field in order to make critical analyses of a position like Darwinism, precisely because Darwinism is not, at least in its classical and in its revised modern different forms, is not, strictly speaking, a scientific, naturalistic, quote-unquote, theory about man's origin, descent, progress, or lack thereof, etc., etc. It's actually a worldview that was implemented and given, if you will, promoted with the intention of displacing more classical modes of thinking, actually even logical modes of thinking. So I'm going to be coming at it from that perspective largely. So it should be added that, first of all, one reason I don't think that a person, especially in my case, needs to have extensive training in all the different theories and modes and views of Darwinism and biological evolution is that I've had that crammed down my throat from high school and even earlier all the way up into grad school. So, I mean, I've heard this view for decades. I've heard constant argumentation from basically every professor I've had, particularly in classes that were, science-related, astronomy, things like that, natural sciences. So I'm not a stranger to the basics of the view. And from the perspective of philosophy, particularly from the school of philosophy that I adhere to, philosophy that's more, I guess what you might say, more ancient, more in the direction of Platonic, more in the direction of the esoteric, more in the direction of what we call transcendental philosophy. By that, I don't mean the transcendentalists like, American literature, but rather transcendentalism in the sense of Van Til, P.F. Strawson, and people like that, who are, of course, famous, noted philosophers, particularly P.F. Strawson. So that school, which I guess for simplicity's sake is more of an a priorist approach, tends to focus on the big picture, looking at the foundational assumptions and beliefs of a system that are then built upon by other beliefs and propositions and so forth. That, in other words, therefore, this approach has the advantage of being able to point out the foundational problems that can essentially destroy the entire system, right? Ultimately, if a system is built on something that is foundationally flawed, then that view, that system as a whole, ultimately doesn't work for whatever it's aiming to prove or demonstrate or achieve. That's not to say, as I've pointed out before, that people who adopt that view or adopt, false starting points, false presuppositions, it's not to say that, within their lives they can't make true discoveries or advance human knowledge or so forth or so on simply because they have faulty presuppositions. No, on the contrary, they can obviously make discoveries, make advancements, and this should be pretty obvious, but I've dealt with that elsewhere in the podcast I did on epistemology and metaphysics in this regard. So when we want to look at something like Darwinism, most people have several operating assumptions that cause them to come at it from a certain perspective or a certain set of perspectives that when I approach the question, I already do not have and reject as false. For example, one of the assumptions that most people have who approach this is that they just, we're still living in the sort of the lingering after effects of the Enlightenment are still around, and so that means that people still approach something like science or something like the investigation of facts or the natural world, whatever, with a host of assumptions, one of which is that facts come sort of pre-interpreted. Like I can just approach something like, the study of earthworms without any prior baggage or assumptions on my part, that my view of the world isn't seen through rose-colored glasses, that I don't have any preconceived notions, and that my investigation of the earthworm just will sort of imprint itself upon me as a blank slate. That it comes with its own sort of prepackaged interpretation that's not related to the rest of my beliefs and assumptions. But of course, that's just simply not true. And there's a long philosophical track that can be shown and argumentation that can be given to demonstrate that, Enlightenment theories of the tabula rasa, that we're a blank slate, which are basically bound up to Enlightenment naive empiricism, are all false. And so it's from that perspective that I reject that of many starting points, right? So in other words, people will come to, well, let's take the average person who works in a field like biology or something like that. They approach this issue with the operant assumption that they're just studying the natural world, and they don't have any presuppositions or assumptions about what they're studying, and that when they look at the earthworm or the life of the earthworm, or when they study the age of the earth or something like that, they don't have any presuppositions about the content of what they're studying. That instead it's all just given to them as what Van Til called brute factuality. That's just sort of self-interpreted. But that's false, right? There are no brute facts that don't involve some interpretation or web of interpretive propositions that you hold about that thing, right? So when you approach the earthworm, you already have a whole set of beliefs about the natural world, about the earthworm, about that worm's relationship to the age of the earth, so forth, so on, already working in your mind. I mean, presumably the person who's a scientist does, right? And we're not talking about the kid playing on the beach or whatever. The person working in the lab, working in the field of science, it is impossible, in other words, to work in the way that the Enlightenment blank slate tabula rasa empiricists would have men operating, right? So in other words, a faulty presupposition about anthropology that the Enlightenment has bequeathed is still the dominant view, particularly amongst academics and those in the sciences, right? And the same goes for people that work in, say, physics, right? Because in modern physics and in theoretical physics too, the operant assumption is still naive empiricism and tabula rasa, and that leads them to naturalism and materialism for the most part. That's the predominant view. And of course that is the outcome of, if you start with the presupposition of tabula rasa, blank slate, enlightenment, empiricism, that's where you're led. That position works itself out logically to materialism, reductionist, atomism views that are basically ultimately completely incoherent, right? And the reason that that's a problem is that those positions then lead to even more ridiculous positions that are ultimately completely destructive to the possibility of knowledge at all, right? And so we get into what we call the naturalistic fallacy or the deterministic fallacy, right? And that's one of the major problems for materialism as a worldview. But the problems are actually much deeper than just simply thinking that you can approach something like the earthworm, that it will sort of reveal itself to you in a prepackaged brute factuality without any prior interpretive reality, if you will, or without any prepackaging, right? That you're going to approach the earthworm as a blank slate. It simply isn't possible. For one, we can just look at the philosophy of language and the philosophy of human interaction with the world, or metaphysics. When you talk about the earthworm, when you pick that thing out as you approach it in the lab or in the world as a scientist, that right there, that action of just simply predicating earthworm of that thing, that is an act that involves a whole bunch of philosophical assumptions. Right? And that's why this is the brand of philosophy that I adhere to, right? Transcendental philosophy. When you approach that thing, you're actually assuming a whole host of beliefs that you may not be consciously aware of, but the fact that you're not consciously aware of it doesn't mean that you're not still operating on those assumptions. One assumption, for example, is that language is able to pick out a specific object in the world, and that predicating meaning to that object, that meaning then adheres over time. Okay? So when you call that object an earthworm, this is operating on the assumption that earthworm is this meaningful term, or this meaningful symbolic act that you're engaging in, that in some way connects up to that object in the world, and that meaning adheres over time. Okay, in philosophy, this is called the problem of identity, or identity over time. And it's a problem that someone like David Hume brought up, right? Someone of that same enlightenment empiricist tradition. So, that, again, is just another example of engaging in something that is a presupposition, right? Engaging in something that is at work, even though we may not be consciously thinking about how we're able to do that, right? And so what that demonstrates, what that shows, is that when you are predicating earthworm, or that using that term, using that symbolic linguistic act, and attributing a title or a name or a set of symbols and sounds to that thing in the world that you call earthworm, you're also associating that and that event with all your other past instances of earthworm. So every other time that you, in your memory, have thought, have encountered an earthworm, or read about an earthworm, or saw an earthworm on a documentary or whatever, all of that is wrapped up in and goes along with your present interaction with the earthworm in the world. And what that means is that there is no such thing as approaching something like an earthworm or any other object of investigation in the field of the sciences without a prior interpretation, right? It's just impossible to do. There's no way to, now granted, I mean, yeah, we can encounter things for the first time in our experience. If you grew up on an island and you never had a glass of wine, and you flew to Rome and tasted some fine wine, that would be your first experience with wine. But from then on, well, actually, even still, if someone told you about the wine, you would already have a sort of a preconceived idea of what you were going to be involved in. So even still, it's not a situation where you're a completely blank slate. Now, if you didn't know about it at all and you encountered a glass of wine or a bottle of wine or something like that, a situation like what we see in The Gods Must Be Crazy, where the bottle of Coke falls out of the sky and lands in front of the African tribesmen. In some sense, you would definitely be encountering something new, right? Or in the same way, new species are discovered all the time. So this is not to say that we don't ever encounter or discover something new as individuals or as in some scientific community, of course, right? But even still, what's encountered is still interpreted within a known framework of beliefs and knowledge that we already possess, right? So the new species of earthworm is still a part of some set of earthworms that are operating under some title of the species or whatever, right? So don't misunderstand me as to say something stupid that we don't ever encounter something new. Rather, that anytime we encounter something, whether new or not, it's always going to be interpreted within a framework of concepts and memories that we've already had with that object or with some similar object. That's what I'm trying to say. And while that sounds maybe a little bit obtuse or you may be saying, what's the point of this? Again, the point was to show that when someone approaches something like the study of the earthworm in the modern fields of the sciences, most of them are still approaching with the perspective of the leftovers and vestiges of the Enlightenment empiricist worldview. Now, it's not very hard to deconstruct and show the impossibility of the Enlightenment empiricist worldview because it's been done, so many times over the last several hundred years. And again, the point is not just to show that the discoveries that are made within the sciences are always wrong, or of course not, that would be ridiculous, but rather that, again, a superstructure can be built upon foundations that are false, right? And while the superstructure may work for a while, and it may produce things and function for a while, ultimately, if the more foundational beliefs that are holding it all up are false, basically you've got a crack that in time will bring down that whole superstructure. And this gets into different philosophies of like systems analysis and worldviews as well. But there's a similarity there. Like just as if a computer program has a virus, eventually that virus can destroy the entire operating system of the computer. In the same way, if a bridge has a crack, even though that bridge may function for a while, eventually that crack works itself out and the bridge collapses. Eventually, naive empiricism being adopted by the Western world as its functioning philosophy, eventually we are now seeing the ultimate collapse of those philosophical assumptions. And of course, the collapse of the West is, involves a whole host of other issues and problems too, but people operate on the basis of their belief systems. And so the erroneous beliefs are really the central points at which the West has made big-time mistakes and for which it is collapsing. And one of those views, I'm convinced, in my research and in my training as a philosopher, is adopting views like naive empiricism. So, naive empiricism, then, enlightenment empiricism, is really the ethos and the milieu, the Weltanschauung, the air in which we breathe that has produced the Darwinian model. And it's important to understand that the Darwinian model, as I've said, is not this neutral theory, this neutral approach to just simply studying the natural world and different biological entities. Rather, the Darwinian scheme is actually an entire mythos. At least its emergence, its classical perception and promotion is that. It has undergone revisions in our century, and particularly as we approach the 21st century, is attempted to be divested of a lot of its older notions of things like racialism and so forth. But from my perspective, it's very difficult to divorce that whole view from its actual origins in mythology, right? And so what we actually begin to see over time, and I have a friend who is a specialist in the philosophy of science. I'll be interviewing him next. His name is James Kelly. He actually works at at a university that has one of the largest libraries dealing with the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science was actually one of my favorite classes in my college experience, and I actually debated the professor of that class. And so I feel like I have a good grounding in this matter. And what we learn, what becomes evident from this approach, is again that there's actually an entire worldview. I don't know how else to put it, or how simply to put it, that is that kind of all goes together, if you will. Okay, that functions as the presupposition or the operating system, if you will, for the interpretation of these facts. Okay, and the more that I went down the road of studying propaganda and studying psyops and things like that for my thesis, the more I began to see that that's actually much more believable, right? So maybe 10 years ago when I was in college and taking philosophy of science, it was more, I was less willing to believe, if you will, that entire belief systems can be foisted on people as a sort of scam. And at that time, I would have taken probably just a more rationalist approach to it and thought that, well, this is just what, it's kind of the popular philosophy, and this is just what people are adopting, and maybe it has some merits, blah, blah, blah. But no, actually, I believe that centralized, secretive powers actually do have the ability to foist entirely false, entirely deceptive worldviews on large masses of people. And really, this has just gone on since since the Enlightenment in the West, to where there's just been this just almost total adoption of just completely absurd views. So what that says to me is something more, it says more to me about human nature than it does, I guess, about, the philosophy of science or, something like that. It actually says to me that people are very easy to convince, and people are unfortunately not that smart on the whole, because it's not very difficult to show that these views are false. So I want to backtrack a little bit and discuss how we got to the point of the acceptance of naive empiricism, which led to Darwinism. Because there's a sort of a philosophical a trek that the West took that I believe led us to this point. And from there, I think we can get an accurate portrayal of what Darwinism is, and from there look at its actual claims, or at least what are still the normative claims of that worldview. And again, I want to stress that it's actually a worldview. It functions like a religion. It has its dogmas. It has its saints. It has its doctors, if you will. It has its confession. And we will be able to dismantle and parcel out what I believe are so many foundational flaws that really we're forced to something like some kind of a view of creation. So I will be arguing for creation, but I'm not going to be giving the sort of classic cheesy creationist arguments. This is going to be an in-depth philosophical analysis that's going to trace it all the way up through. And we're going to have to look at things like classical foundationalist epistemology, which is the sort of dominant ancient and medieval view, particularly emerging from Aristotle, and then emerging with certain Western Church fathers, particularly with Aquinas, that then becomes a big debate in the Middle Ages, and with the question of realism and nominalism, that then eventually morphs into the Enlightenment, and then morphs into Darwinian materialism. And so then we'll look at actual beliefs of Darwinism. So in laying the groundwork, we want to talk about the how we got to this point. The ancient world began to question things, and in the realm of philosophy, and so the natural sciences used to be a division of philosophy. And so with people like Aristotle, we still have the same taxonomy or naming of species that goes back 2,000 years, or 2,500 years. So Aristotle takes philosophy in the direction of empiricism, although he was not what we might call a strict empiricist. That's a later evolution in philosophy. Aristotle was in the direction of empiricism, and so he differed from this the more mystical view of Plato, and took philosophy in the direction of what will eventually become empirical science, even though Aristotle was, of course, first and foremost a metaphysician. And if you read his excellent treatise on metaphysics, Aristotle says metaphysics is the sort of the queen of the sciences. So, I don't mean to cast Aristotle as sort of an Enlightenment empiricist, because he's not that. But what he did do was lay the groundwork for moving in the direction of the empirical sciences as their own sort of independent, supposedly autonomous functioning body of information. So, as Aristotle's works are rediscovered in the Middle Ages, another question had begun to emerge around that same time. You see this in the writings of Anselm when he deals with Abelard, and that's the question of nominalism and realism, and that is a medieval version of the sort of Aristotelian and Platonic question. Except the nominalists begin to take us in a different direction. They're more radical than anything Aristotle would have ever thought. The nominalists actually propose a more radical view of empiricism, such that for them, universals, or the idea of abstract concepts or logical entities, that those are merely the breath of the mouth, as Abelard says. In other words, they're not metaphysical realities. They're simply symbolic terms that are given and created in a purely temporal fashion. We don't have access to any sort of Platonic ideals or universals or essences or so forth in human cognition. And so they oppose the realists. And the realists believe that universals or universal concepts were real, that they were actually behind the objects of experience. And they of course had philosophical basis and reason to believe that. I am a realist, personally, because that is part of the school of philosophy that I adhere to, that I think is correct. But it gets a little more complicated because, Aristotle is a realist too. Aristotle believes universal concepts are real. But this is the point of departure for getting to the modern world, because again, the nominalists were much more radical. And so people in this tradition are Occam, William of Occam, Gabriel Bile, who will be very influential on people like Luther. And so for the nominalists, the walk away from metaphysics has begun. And what this will do by the time of the British Enlightenment empiricists is achieve a full break, because the Enlightenment empiricists are the inheritors of the nominalist tradition. In fact, the Enlightenment empiricists are nominalists. And not only are they nominalists, they, especially with someone like Hume, even take it in a further direction than someone like a medieval person like Abelard would have gone. So what we see in this historical process in the West is people taking their assumptions or their conclusions, their starting points, the basic foundational beliefs that they have about the world, and over time they work themselves out in a more consistent fashion. Now, what I mean by that is that not more consistent necessarily in a good way, but more consistent with what the founding assumptions were. And so just as if, I said earlier, a building can have a faulty foundation, over time that crack in the foundation is what I'm talking about. It's going to work itself out, if you will, and the building will collapse. In the same way, belief systems, philosophical views, worldviews, are foundational, most basic beliefs, are starting points for how we view the world and do philosophy, so forth, so on, will have built in them a process of working themselves out to their conclusion. Philosophers like Cornelius Van Til called this coming to epistemological self-consciousness, meaning that over time in the life of the individuals and in the life of cultures like the West, that these problems work themselves out based on their starting points. So nominalism worked its way into becoming empiricism. Like I said, empiricism is a nominalist position. It denies metaphysical substances, metaphysical realities, especially in the realm of conceptual entities. So, for the empiricists, then, beliefs that we have about the world they only originate in the human mind based on past experience. So you are basically a bundle of just your collected experiences. There's nothing to you as an individual in terms of a self or an identity or a soul beyond a collection of experiences. So essentially you're like a camcorder, is the best way to put this, because the Enlightenment empiricists believe that man was basically a blank slate that sort of recorded all of his experience like a camera, and then this movie of all your past experiences is your life. That's who you are. But you're not anything beyond, especially for the Enlightenment atheists that were empiricists, like Hume, you're not anything beyond those things, because nothing can be known beyond empirical experience. So all of that background is necessary to understand the setting for the development of the worldview, the belief system, the philosophy, the theory of Darwinism. And it is into this stage, this setting, sort of on the nadir of the Enlightenment, as it gave way to industrialism and sort of the modern, according to Dr. Carroll Quigley, modern merchant capitalism and monopolistic capitalism. Concomitant with all of that was the rise of Darwinism. But so the setting for Darwinism is all that. And at the time, it was married to a worldview, an Anglo supremacist worldview, based on not just necessarily racialism, because racial views are as old as, all tribes and cultures. But it was married to a certain approach to imperialism that was unique with people like Cecil Rhodes, John Ruskin, the Royal Society, and so forth. And so it is only with the aid and through the aid of the Royal Society, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and so forth, that the marriage of Darwinism to what was believed to be an Anglo supremacy, that it was able to achieve such widespread acceptance, because it basically had the support of the most powerful entity at that time. Now again, I would refer you to Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope for that question, for a more a lengthy, fleshed out basis for that claim, as well as I think the name is John Roberts, I believe is his name, but the book is Cecil Rhodes' Flawed Colossus. Also expands on those on that history. But this is the setting for the spread of Darwinism. In other words, kind of like Christianity spread because of Koine Greek that Alexander the Great sort of prepared throughout the Hellenic culture of the first century. In the same way, we can see the Darwinian theory associated with the mythology of the Pax Britannia, or the mystical imperialism of the British Empire. And if you know about the history of the British Empire and its view of itself, you know that it, in works like The Fairy Queen of Edmund Spenser, the imperial mythos of the British was that it was the continuation of the Roman Empire. So just as the Roman Empire had its myth and mythology and Virgil's Aeneid, in the same way the British imperial mythos was supposed to be what we read in Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. But the British Empire took its own Protestant course with Henry VIII, of course, and so it no longer carried the Roman papal connection from that point on, and became its own sort of shadow merchant banking empire. And this is found in the works of many noted historians. This is not a conspiracy theory. And so it is with that mindset that the monopolistic capitalist view of the British Empire, which one can see at the same time as Darwinism exemplified in the East India Company, is a great example. One can then see a connection between the social Darwinian view and the economic monopolistic capitalist view that were basically parallel, and it makes sense. It all goes together, right? I mean, if you're the apex predator or the fittest to survive, then you're the top banker or the queen, right, or the king or whatever. You can see the parallel there. But mythologies or worldviews need a mythology. Empires need a mythology about themselves, and this is, of course, a characteristic. This is characteristic of all historical empires, is that they have their own mythos, their own grand narrative about who they are, where they came from. They're basically God incarnate. That's ultimately the summation of all the classic imperial stories, is that the emperor or the king or the queen is God or goddess on earth, and the empire is the body of the god, which he or she rules on earth. And so, therefore, this is all crucial to understanding Darwinism, because when we look at T.H. Huxley, when we look at Darwin, we look at Sir Francis Galton, and now I've read the works. I've read some of Francis Galton. I've read essays and sermons by what would become the seed forms of the eugenics movement from Anglican pastors like Malthus. And what we see is a connection between a certain view, in other words, a certain view of anthropology begins to emerge that is ultimately subservient to the Anglo Empire. And it is from this milieu, this zeitgeist, that Darwinism emerges as a new, quote, naturalistic assessment of man's origins, who man is, where man is going. At that time, because of the Pax Britannia and the the Anglo mythos, it was appropriate to consider the Anglo establishment as the sort of summit and apex of humanity. Again, we see this, Cecil Rhodes even wrote about this. The other lords at that time, Lord Milner's Kindergarten, Ruskin's Secret Society, the Rhodes Trust, and so forth, they all had that same view, that sort of the apex of humanity was found in the British Empire, and that the British Empire would ultimately be the means by which, again, the great society would be implemented worldwide. But what emerged was actually a very highly racial view. Now, what one's views of race are, I'm not really going that route or intending to debate that. I'm simply trying to give the historical climate within which Darwinian theory emerged. And the point of that is to show that it's absolutely not a neutral, quote-unquote, scientific theory. Far from it. It is the exact opposite. It is actually a mythos intimately tied up with the British mystical imperialism, as it is so called. And there's a book I would recommend by Gould and Fitzgerald called Afghanistan, the Untold Story, and it deals with the Anglo-American establishment's view of itself as the basically the savior of mankind, ultimately through eugenics. But it deals extensively in a very scholarly way with the the messianic view of itself that the Pax Britannia had. But it's important to understand eugenics and Darwinism as intimately tied up and connected at the close of the 19th century. And so that's why Darwin, Huxley, Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley, T.H. Huxley, all the Huxleys, the Galtons, these families adopt this worldview and promote it as the ultimate sort of goal of their life, is to convert the world over to Darwinism, ultimately through worldwide entities like the UN and the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the American version of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, based around the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable groups. And so to establish Darwinism and the since the British Empire's power began to wane in the 20th century, what we'll call the shadow establishments, imperium, or what Quigley calls the Anglo-American establishment, the myth that this establishment has adopted for itself, just like the Roman Empire had a myth of the Caesar as the sort of god on earth and the apex of humanity on earth, Caesar as the son of God. In the same way, for the Anglo-American establishment, its myth is Darwinism, and Darwinism is best exemplified in, rather than a bloodline of Nero or somebody saying that they're descended from the sun god, or like the Chinese emperors used to say that they were the descendants of the sun god. Rather, now the myth has just become naturalized, if you will. Well, it's not so much a sun god as it was just nature itself, quote unquote, gave rise to the evolution of man, at the apex of which is the Anglo-Saxon king, queen, banker, Cecil Rhodes, right? And that is the apologetic for which Darwin is working and writing. And so Darwin writes his Origin of Species and the treatise on the favored races of man, precisely with the intent of showing that it is Anglo-man that is the sort of apex of this evolutionary struggle in history. And of course he does, provide argumentation for a naturalistic account of the origin of the species. So I'm not trying to say that the whole treatise is all about race and eugenics, but that actually is the point of the treatise, ultimately, right? I mean, it's not every single argument, every single page. Much of it is, what at that time was called natural history or natural science. But that ultimately is the goal. The purpose of this book is to prove that point, that Anglo-man is the apex of lengthy, progressive evolution, right? So it's important to notice then that within this worldview, it is not ultimately scientific. It is the presentation of an entire new mythology is ultimately its goal. And until you realize that and understand that, I really don't think it's possible to interact with or understand or confront or examine Darwinism, because it's just so prevalent and accepted as just, unquestionable. Yet most people don't know its origin. And my research, my degree in history, my study of history, and the evolution of cultures and civilizations, it's important to understand that ideas don't just drop out of the sky, out of a vacuum. They don't just suddenly appear. That itself, in fact, is a very Enlightenment view. No, ideas have an origin, and they come about within a certain culture and emerge historically, in a certain setting, right? Just like you don't come, as I said earlier, when you examine the earthworm in your lab, you don't examine the earthworm without preconceived ideas and presuppositions about the earthworm and who it is and what an earthworm is. You come to the table with preconceived notions and presuppositions and an idea already in your head of what an earthworm is. In the same way, the emergence of Darwinism could not have occurred, or would not have occurred as far as we know, outside of the British imperial mythos. And that is its origin. It is in that strand of 19th century British imperial racial hegemony. And it cannot be, I don't think, accurately critiqued or opposed or questioned outside of understanding outside of understanding the fact. This isn't conjecture. That's a fact. That's where it came from. It has nothing to do with being this purely neutral scientific theory. No, it is absolutely 100% bound up in everything that I just argued. And so it's from that setting and that same power structure that Darwinism continues to be propagated into the 20th century. And it gets married to a bunch of other theories such as socialism and fascism and national socialism and so forth. Marx, writes a letter to Darwin about how great he thinks it was, right? But my intention is not really to get into a bunch of things like Marxism, but rather just to show that it becomes a sort of a worldwide phenomenon because it's assumed that this is now a naturalistic explanation of man's origins and of his destiny. It's important to know that initially Darwinism was married to the idea of progress. Now, in time, and as we move into the 20th century and up until our day, Darwinism begins to correct itself in terms of its less palatable views, and it tries to drop the racial elements. It begins to try to drop things like phrenology, the study of skulls, at least in the quote scientific community. It begins to drop its associations with originally evolutionary theory in Anglican circles was still theistic. So theistic evolution is actually the sort of the original model of this. Darwin himself in his lifetime, if you read about Darwin, was still a theistic evolutionist for a long time, and then as he got older, he just sort of felt like there wasn't a need for any of the theism anymore, that the theory was sufficient on its own grounds as a purely naturalistic view to explain origins and so forth. But so again, the history is crucial, and as we move into the 20th century, it becomes much more diversified, and it becomes enshrined as the mythos, right? That is, this is now the new story of man, and it is supposed to replace all of the previous religious and traditional mythologies. And if you study propaganda, and if you study psychological warfare, it's very easy to understand this this line of thinking, this methodology, because in psychology and psychological warfare, propaganda, if you look at things like Soviet propaganda or Nazi propaganda, just like with the imperial mythos, if you're an establishment, you need a cohesive belief system to try to hold things together. And so we look at the United Nations and the Secular Humanist Manifesto or Humanist Manifesto 1 and 2. These sort of exemplify post-enlightenment Darwinian views of man and secularism and scientism, the belief that science is the be-all, end-all answer to all problems, which is very ironic given the fact that science also in our era supposedly says that science can't answer the question why. Yet so many people that adopt this position, what we can call scientism, simultaneously believe that science ultimately can and will answer all questions. So it's very much a faith-based enterprise. Even though there's no present evidence of anything like that, the assumption that there's just this entity that's called science, this sort of this monolithic thing out there, science, that will that ultimately takes on the status of a new deity. There is no such thing as a monolithic entity called science. There's not a great body of elite that are science. There are individuals who are scientists who have varying and diversified views and beliefs that work on different sorts of projects. But there is no such grand body of Olympians that are known as science. And once you deconstruct that kind of a mythology in your own mind, it becomes clear that that's the case. So, back to the question, back to the issue of Darwinism. So then, that is we've then discussed the historical course by which Darwinism was able to emerge. And as we get into the 21st century, the 20th and 21st century, Darwinian evolution basically becomes like I said, the standard go-to explanation worldwide for everything. And what are all of the great globalist entities, what we might call the New World Order, have adopted this as their mythos. And so the United Nations, the Anglo-American establishment that is behind the United Nations, has adopted this whole belief system as its own. And that's why it's propagated in all schools, in all universities. That's why it's taught as sort of unquestionable, or rather it's enforced. You don't get published in journals. You don't get, jobs at such and such universities unless you follow this line. And there's a reason for this. And the reason for this ultimately is ultimately part of the conspiracy, as I've outlined elsewhere, and as you'll see in works like Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. But this is precisely why I don't believe you can divorce the theory from its actual historical setting, where it emerged, why it emerged, for what reason it emerged, why it's promulgated worldwide. And then once we understand that and we begin to have even the will to question it, we begin to see that actually everything that it proposes is pretty much baloney, right? Now you might say, no, wait a minute. How could, billions of people believe something? How could, I'm assuming that, out of 8 billion people, several billion do believe this. At least a couple billion, perhaps. But even if not a billion, hundreds of millions of people just assume that this is true. There's no way that could happen because, people wouldn't be that easily fooled. Actually, whatever view you believe to be correct, we can easily figure out how it's the case that millions and billions of people could be wrong, because we can simply look at the fact that, well, at one point, people believed a lot of superstitious things, right? So in the ancient world, if you believe that people used to believe in animism, right? That sticks and rocks and trees were God, or pantheism, or something like that. And if you believe that that is a superstitious, stupid view, then right there, you have evidence of how easily masses of people can be led to believe something completely false. If you adhere to Christianity, you believe that most of the world presently believes something that is manifestly false, since most of the world is not presently of that faith. If you believe some other religious view, then obviously it's still the case, right? So the point being is that the mass acceptance of Darwinism really says absolutely nothing about its truth or falsehood. Even if you believe Darwinism is true, then you believe that for millennia people were deceived about and were wrong about our origins, right? So, again, the fallacy of authority, or the fallacy of popular opinion, is just that, a fallacy. And, of course, Darwinian apologists are some of the worst at fallacies and ignoring fallacies. And granted, the most religious apologists are very bad as well and commit endless versions of fallacies too. But it's important to start out with the understanding that mass acceptance of Darwinism has absolutely nothing to do with whether it's true or not, right? So once we begin to sort of get these weeds out of the garden, we can begin to actually plant some seeds and make progress in discussing this issue. So the popularity has nothing to do with its truthfulness nor its falsehood. And the study of belief systems and propaganda is actually a good way to understand how it is that mass populace and mass audiences can be misled. For example, when we look at the images of Nazi Germany and the sort of the big rallies, the imperial Hitlerian rallies, we see masses of people that believed in a mythology created by Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg is the father of the Nazi mythos. And he was, quite candid that he created a mythology for that belief system. And others were involved in that too. Goebbels, Himmler, were also involved in crafting the mythology for that worldview. But it's a great example of how, just masses and crowds of people can be led into believing something that is not true. And in the same way, it's not very difficult if you have a classical education and you're trained in philosophy. It's not very difficult to really pick apart in a presuppositional fashion the really glaring basic problems in Darwinian and neo-Darwinian theories. And for one, they bear such a striking similarity to mythologies that it's just baffling. It's sort of astounding that they're given such hallowed treatment and status as being, as having even such explanatory power. I mean, I don't even think they have explanatory power. I think they're basically bankrupt. I mean, they really have almost no worth as theories of explanation of origins and so forth at all. Now, that's not to say that what we call microevolution, that that species adapt over time to their environment, Well, that's not even questioned. I don't know anyone that questions that. That's undeniable. I mean, equatorial dwellers have darker skin, and it's entirely, it is the most plausible view that they develop dark skin, pigmentation, so that they could live in that climate more easily, being exposed to the sun. That's a very clear, rational explanation. But then to extrapolate from that and sort of make these leaps, and that's what we're going to see as we dissect actual Darwinian views, to leap from observations of that nature towards grand and grandiose assumptions and grand narratives about what was the case billions of years ago, supposedly, and what may be the case, in the future, as the early Darwinian mythology was sort of bound up with the idea of evolving into being gods, right? The kind of mythology that we see in propaganda like 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's a great example of the propaganda of Darwinian mythology. Rather, to extrapolate from an observed instance of, say, equatorial dwellers develop darker skin to better adapt to their climate, to say that, over billions of years, then, all species must have then been involved in this process of adaptation to the environment, which just sort of had this assumed power of inherent progress, moving towards a more fit, a more complex state, is a huge, huge leap. Now, I'm aware that Darwinian theory does not, and various neo-Darwinian theories do not make the argument that simply by something like a single observed instance that, like the adaptation of equatorial dwellers to their sunny environment, that's the only argument that they make, or the only claim. No, there are all kinds of studies and examples like this. One of the most easily dissected is homologies. The Darwinian view argument from homologies is similar to what I just described, but it goes like this. When looking at the argument for a common ancestor, the best way to do this is to say, look at the structure of a femur, say in a human, and we look at a dog has a femur, and then we look at birds kind of have femurs too, and so we can then extrapolate from this that since these species have femurs, there must have been a common ancestor with a femur. Now that is the argument from homology. And there are other similarities where arguments are made from, look at the human zygote in the womb, it kind of has this, fishy, shrimpy look to it, and that's kind of similar to like fish or shrimp. So that's another, in other words, similar looking, what we call in philosophy semiotics or symbology, similar structure is then extrapolated into this huge leap of logic that because there's similarity, there must have been a common ancestor. But this is a huge leap, it's a huge non sequitur. Just because something looks similar, that's not an argument. It doesn't follow from that there's a common ancestor. Now, granted, I might look like my father, and one might, make the assessment that, there's a good chance that you came from that guy, since you look like him. But this is a different thing. We're not talking about merely a similar appearance. We're talking about simply a perceived similarity in structure, like a femur, that therefore then all femurs originated from, at one point, an entity, a single entity that, or a few entities that had femurs. That's a huge leap. And as a philosopher, and as good philosophers, we know that that's more an exercise in semiotics, or the interpretation of symbols, than it is just flat out, quote, science, right? But ultimately, if you're writing papers and doing work in a lab, you're all day long, you're basically manipulating symbols. And so basically all of it is semiotics. So to be technical, the manipulation of all of symbols is semiotics, and so science is just as much semiotics as anything else. But scientists don't think about it that way. They're not aware of semiotics usually, or philosophy and philosophical questions, when they're doing what they just have been trained to do. And so they've been, of course, trained in an atmosphere of Darwinism, and what they think is a pure empirical science, none of which is true. But again, it's very easy to look at, and maybe under this I'll put a link to the Berkeley University of UC Berkeley page on evolution and Darwinism and the homologies. But again, it's very clear that it's a huge myth that we are now adopting as we progress through these different arguments that are emerging for Darwinian theory. So the homologies, the assumed need for a single common ancestor and so forth, the idea of extremely, from a human vantage point, extremely long lengths of time for this progress to occur, the idea of the natural selection of the fittest. These are, again, philosophical assumptions, right? If you haven't studied philosophy, it's very difficult to get this across. These are not things that you're empirically recording, okay? These are interpretations of events. And interpretations of events, that doesn't mean that they're all relative. They may be right, they may be wrong. Interpretations of events, though, are not a purely empirical science. They're interpretive work. Just like reading a novel and interpreting the meanings and the symbology, right, is not purely an empirical science, because it goes along with the rest of the ideas that you bring to the table when you read that novel. In the same way, interpreting the data before you, interpreting these, quote, facts, they're not brute facts. They're facts that are part of a web of beliefs and interpretations that you have. You already have a worldview. And the worldview that you come to the table with, that you come to the lab with, is the matrix, is the operating system by which you are going to interpret and place the facts before you. See, again, that's the whole point here. Facts don't come as uninterpreted brute facts. They only come to you as interpreted. And that is inescapable. It is absolutely impossible to, as humans, we are just so constituted that way. Whether you believe that we're constituted that way theistically or not, we are so constituted that it's not possible to approach any fact of experience that's divorced from some interpretation. And that's just so obvious that only philosophers, in ridiculous exercises, could ever get us to the point where we didn't realize that was obvious, right? Only philosophers giving way then to supposed science as a purely empirical endeavor could ever even come up with something so bizarre as this. So, understanding epistemology, understanding worldviews, understanding philosophy and metaphysics and semiotics makes it more and more and more clear how what's being presented is a grand interpretive scheme or narrative, a mythos, right? A religion, and not something, not what it claims to be. It's not a purely empirical, fact-based endeavor or enterprise. Hardly. There's no such thing as a purely fact-based endeavor or enterprise. That doesn't exist. So, that is, again, bound up, as I started talking about foundationalist epistemology. Foundationalist epistemology is this older view, this older idea, ironically, which is as much as the Darwinian empiricist-minded thinkers and apologists want to present themselves as sort of the nouveau fad. They're actually adhering to older, outdated modes of epistemology. Now, when I say they're older, outdated modes, like foundationalist epistemology, I don't mean that the claims of foundationalist epistemology, like that there are foundational axioms, that those are false, right? I'm not saying that, as say a postmodernist or a nihilist or something would say, or a relativist, that there are no foundational beliefs, like that they're all false. That's not what I'm saying. But for those that are familiar with this debate, the distinction between foundationalist epistemology and other views like a coherence theory of truth go like this. For people in the ancient world, say Aristotle, or for the medieval world, say Aquinas, and up even into the Enlightenment era, the predominant view in epistemology, or the science of the theory of knowledge, philosophical view of knowledge, the dominant view was what we can call classical foundationalist epistemology. And this view would hold that there are basic axioms, right? Basic propositions, basic views or beliefs that are so self-evident and unquestionable that they are where we start. So we start with things like, in logic, say the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction. A is A, the law of identity. A cannot be A and non-A, right? The law of non-contradiction. Those are axiomatic, self-evident truths that we begin with. And from this starting point that is abundantly clear to everyone, self-evident, we will then, common ground that we all agree on these things, we will then work out from these things, sort of like an algorithm maybe, we'll work out any other claims. So does God exist? We don't know. We don't know about that. But we do know that A equals A. And so like in Thomistic apologetics, for example, something like the law of non-contradiction or logic is viewed to be absolutely certain, or as certain as humans can be about it. Things like theism, the existence of God, although they are certain, the kind of God, or who God is, or what God is, or so forth, these are less certain. And so we have to, faith, right? Faith is aided by reason, right? But it is not ultimately the foundation of human reason. Because even though, if we were to say, draw two circles here on a chalkboard, they intersect, right? They're not completely covering each other. We'll have a section where they intersect, and that one circle we'll call faith, and the other circle we'll call reason. They are in harmony with one another, but they're not the same thing. And so because they're not the same thing, faith involves uncertainty. Right? Now, I'm not saying fideism. Thomists and classical foundationalists are not fideists. They do believe that faith is rational. But they don't believe that you can go any more basic or question at any other level beyond self-evident axioms. So you can't really go beyond the laws of logic or the laws of non-contradiction. You can't really go beyond 1 + 1 = 2. There's no other starting point, right? But this view leads to a lot of bizarre notions and ideas. And actually, historically, as this worked itself out in the West, I believe it actually led to empiricism. This actually led to nominalism. So, in this way, the nominalists were actually raising a valid question, because if we start with observation and empiricism, as Aquinas and classical foundationalists obviously do, we're never going to get any kind of empirical verification or proof for the things that we're talking about that are non-empirical, right? We're not going to get proof for God's existence or for non-empirical entities by empirical methods, right? But Aquinas is an empiricist, ultimately, in terms of his approach being empirical, ultimately. It's not an a priorist approach. Aquinas is a classical foundationalist. And it is, of course, from this view that the West continues its trek from the late Middle Ages in Aquinas, or the high Middle Ages in Aquinas, to ultimately nominalism, because it simply follows from those starting points an empiricism that you're not going to have you can't justify any of the claims of empiricism. Right. Once you start with the empirical method as what you believe is axiomatic and self-evident, and once you start with things like, say the law of identity, A is A, 1 + 1 = 2, when these are your starting points, you ultimately will end up with empiricism, and then ultimately enlightenment scientism. Precisely because what you're doing, even if you're not aware of it, is you are actually making abstract propositions or abstract theories or logical entities or empirical data the ultimate arbiter of truth, right? Something like causality. Right, this is a great one for the classical foundationalists. The causal cosmological principle, right? It was viewed to be so self-evident and unquestionable that it's generally the historic starting point, especially for Thomistic apologetics and the argument for divinity. Even though Aquinas gives 5, I guess he's probably most well known for the cosmological argument. I mean, that's sort of a go-to argument. But there's a problem. I mean, if you start with empiricism, if you start with that, well, that can easily be questioned and deconstructed. You can easily dismantle basic causality when that's the thing that you believe is most certain. Because what ends up happening is causality is actually more certain than any of your religious beliefs in this view, right? But that doesn't make much sense, because according to, if you're a theist, I mean, biblical theology, I mean, Revelation doesn't describe causality as more certain than divinity. I mean, divinity in Exodus says, I am that I am, right? Divinity is more certain. God is more certain than an abstract principle like causality. And even though ultimately in theology God is the origin, or God is the cause of causality, if you will, in the world. God is the first cause. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It doesn't follow from that causality as a philosophical principle is more certain than a personal God, right? That's not at all the way Revelation describes God. Revelation describes God as the starting point, right, of all philosophy. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge, right, according to Solomon. So, again, these are the sort of beginning problems for foundationalist epistemology from the religious perspective, from the revelational perspective, and from the just philosophical perspective. They're problematic. Even if we approach this just merely as a philosopher, they're problematic. And that is why, in the history of the West, the philosophers of the West and the scientists begin to drop classical foundationalist epistemology and its arguments for theism. Because the arguments are terrible. They're not good arguments. They fall because of their starting points. The cosmological argument doesn't prove that the creator of the world is the God described in the scriptures, and that's what it was employed to do. That's what it was supposed to do. But it doesn't do that. All it does is prove that events follow one another in the world. And there's no necessity to accepting a personal creator as described in, say, the scriptures, the biblical scriptures, as that first cause. Right? These are a lot of, for example, Hume's criticisms of the cosmological argument. But there's a reason why there are these criticisms, right? It has nothing to do with agreeing with David Hume simply because he's an Enlightenment empiricist. All David Hume is doing is saying, look, I have the same starting point as you guys, foundationalist epistemology, empiricism. None of this leads to this conclusion, right? All this analogy of being in Aquinas doesn't prove the biblical view of the first cause, of God as a first cause. It doesn't even prove a first cause. All we're doing is analyzing a series of events in the world. Now, yes, if you believe in revelation, if you believe in providence and so forth, causality is obviously true. There is a cosmological principle. There is a first cause. All that's true. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not you can get to that point from empiricism. Can you start with empirical methodology and show by necessity, which is what the whole point of it, the argumentation is, that you can get to the biblical God? And you can't. And so the apologists from the classical and foundationalist schools will say, well, yeah, we're not necessarily trying to prove, we're just showing that it's possible. Well, this is a problem, because the God that's biblical and presented in the Bible doesn't argue that it's possible that he exists, or that he might exist. He argues that he does, right? So it's not a biblical method of apologetics. That's the point. It's not a revelational method of apologetics. It's not the apologetics or the theism that's argued for or given in Revelation. It's a compromised argumentation that's not good, and that's why it failed, and why it does fail. And people are not convinced by the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, because it makes abstract principles such as design or cause to be the starting points, the empirical starting points for a train of argumentation that will somehow end in a personal God presented in the Bible. But it doesn't lead to any of those things. And that's why it doesn't work anymore, and people don't find these arguments to be convincing, because they're not convincing. Instead, there is the transcendental argument, as I've been a proponent of for a long time, 12, 13 years. It's a sound argument, it's a valid argument, and it's most consistent with the theology presented in the Bible, in scriptures, and with the epistemology that I think is given in those scriptures. But let's stick to the issue of Darwinism. So Darwinism then is the apex, if you will, of the classical foundationalist approach to the world, because the empirical theologians, the empirical apologists, eventually got to the point where the evidentiary apologists, if you will, they got to the point where they said, well, we've got all this data, and we've got all this that's possibly supposed to be hey man. So below this I'm going to include an article by Dr. Philip Sherrard that illustrates this point very well, where he discusses Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist and worshipper of Darwinism. And what's really good with this article is that you'll see, as Dr. Sherrard critiques the presuppositions of Teilhard and Darwinism, is that this is an elaborate philosophical system at work here, particularly in someone like Teilhard. And Teilhard represents a continuation of the Darwinian tradition, the progeny of this system. So he's in the succession of those like Lamarck and the famed promoters of this system. I mean, in the early 20th century, it was Jesuits who were leading the charge in this view. So, as well as with the Big Bang. But if you'll take a gander at Dr. Sherrard's criticism of Teilhard, you'll see that what Teilhard represents is sort of the apex of all classical foundationalist thinking. Because, and I had not read Dr. Sherrard's article before I did this podcast. I actually came across it in the middle of this podcast. So you'll see that he makes the same argument that I did about the idea of a division between faith and reason, that these are two separate realms of inquiry that sort of overlap but have their own spheres of authority. And Dr. Sherrard shows very well in someone like Teilhard as sort of the prime example of someone who adopts this approach and then fleshes it out in a more consistent way to where basically the theological elements of the system aren't really even relevant anymore. This just becomes a sort of process theology, again, all because of the assumption of evolution in the Darwinian sense. Once man or man's psyche in the Teilhard system has made the primacy in the universe, sort of the starting point of all knowledge, and since that psyche is the result of a materialistic process, then really the only constant in this scheme is flux. So we have a return of the old Heraclitean position of Greece, the idea that all is flux. And in that kind of a system, nothing is fixed or stable. So there are a multitude of problems with this kind of a position. I mean, it gets really, really difficult philosophically when we talk about invariant principles of logic or mathematics. Other philosophical questions like the question of identity over time. These are very difficult problems for a position where the view is that everything is in flux. You really can't have those things. Those things don't evolve out of it. Invariant, unchanging, non-material principles or concepts don't exist or emerge or evolve out of a materialistic scheme. I mean, they're obviously antithetical to materialism. So I highly recommend that article, and he will actually make a lot of the same points that I'm making. So I think this is sufficient for a philosophical criticism of Darwinism. And maybe in the next podcast I'll move on to do a criticism of the actual claims of Darwinian thinking.